The school bus hadn't stopped there in years, but every afternoon, just before 3, the big brown bear appeared. And when the retired driver stepped out to meet him, it was clear this was no ordinary roadside encounter. By the time Leonard Dunn hung up his bus keys for the last time, he figured his days of sticking to a strict schedule were over. For 42 years, he'd driven the same rural route in the foothills, picking up kids from scattered farmhouses and dropping them home again, rain or shine, blizzard or heatwave. The old yellow bus had been his second home, and the route his daily heartbeat. Now, retired for almost 3 years, his days moved slower. Breakfast at the kitchen table. Coffee on the porch. Fixing a loose hinge on the shed. But every afternoon, without even thinking about it, Leonard would find himself glancing at the clock just before 3. It was the time he used to pull up to the bend in the road near mile marker 12, the same spot he stopped at the winter of '99, the day that had quietly shaped the rest of his life. That day had been brutal, snow stacked shoulder-high on the roadside, wind like knives against his cheeks. He'd been easing the bus along the icy bend when a flicker of movement caught his eye in the ditch. At first, he thought it was a dog. Then he saw the small, rounded ears. The dark eyes. The fur matted with ice. A bear cub. Alone. Leonard had pulled over, leaving the bus idling with the heat on, and trudged down into the drift. The cub had been half buried in snow, barely moving. He'd looked at Leonard with an exhausted, desperate gaze, the kind that didn't care if the man was friend or foe, just that he wasn't the cold. Leonard had wrapped him in an old wool blanket he kept behind his seat for emergencies, tucking it around the tiny frame before carrying him up the embankment. The cub had been lighter than he expected, but the weight had still been solid in his arms. There'd been no mother in sight. No tracks leading away. He'd taken the cub straight to a wildlife rehab center 2 towns over, telling the staff, "Found him on my route. Don't let him freeze." They'd thanked him, promised to do what they could. He hadn't expected to see the cub again. But 2 springs later, on an early April afternoon, Leonard had driven that same stretch in the bus and spotted a young bear, bigger now, but unmistakable, standing by the roadside. As he slowed, the bear had lifted its head, watching him with an almost curious recognition. From then on, every so often, he'd see the bear in that same place. Always in the afternoon. Always calm. Never crossing into the road. Now, years later, Leonard had no bus to drive. But the bear still came. It had started happening shortly after Leonard's retirement. Neighbors mentioned a bear lingering by the bend around the old bus time, and Leonard decided to check for himself. The first time he went there, the bear was taller, broad-shouldered, the rich brown coat glossy in the sun. It had been a strange reunion. The bear had taken a few slow steps forward, stopping just shy of where the gravel met the grass. Leonard had spoken softly, like he might to an old friend. "Well, I'll be. You remember me, don't you?" Now it had become their quiet ritual. At 2:55 every afternoon, Leonard would leave his porch, walk the half-mile down the lane, and wait at the bend. Without fail, the bear would emerge from the trees, stopping at the edge of the clearing. They didn't touch, Leonard knew better than to push boundaries, but they stood close enough to see the other's eyes. It was enough. And each time, Leonard walked home with a strange sense of warmth in his chest, the kind that stayed long after he'd shut the door behind him. The memory of that day in '99 had never really left Leonard, though it came back to him in sharp detail every time he saw the bear waiting at the bend. It had been a Tuesday, just after lunch, when the snow started coming down heavier than the forecast had warned. By the time he was halfway through his route, the visibility had dropped to near nothing. The wipers worked hard against the thick flakes, and the bus tires crunched over ice patches that made his knuckles tighten on the wheel. At mile marker 12, he eased off the gas. The road curved there, hugging a shallow ditch before straightening toward the open fields. That was when something dark against the snow caught his eye, barely a shape, more a disruption in the white. He braked gently, glancing in the rear view to make sure the handful of kids left on board were still chatting in their seats, oblivious. Opening the door, he stepped into the biting wind, the cold needling through his jacket in seconds. The air smelled of sharp pine and fresh snow, his boots sinking deep with each step down the embankment. When he reached the dark shape, he crouched. It wasn't moving much, just the faint rise and fall of breath. The small rounded ears and short muzzle told him exactly what he was looking at. A bear cub. Its fur was clumped with ice, the snow packed around it as if it had been lying there for hours. Leonard could see the shallow pattern of paw prints leading only a short way before vanishing under fresh snow. No sign of the mother. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice low, not wanting to spook the little thing even if it barely had the energy to notice him. The cub opened its eyes, dark, wet, and heavy with exhaustion. Leonard's chest tightened at the look. It wasn't fear in those eyes. It was surrender. He pulled off his gloves and reached for the wool blanket rolled in the emergency kit behind the driver's seat. The wind stung his fingers as he tucked it around the cub, working quickly to cover its small body. When he lifted it, the weight surprised him, lighter than he expected for a wild animal, but still solid enough to remind him it was no stray cat. The cub let out a weak grunt, its head pressing against his chest as if trying to find warmth. Back at the bus, Leonard ignored the wide-eyed stares from the kids in the front seats as he carried the bundle up the steps. "Don't worry, just an animal that needs help," he said, steering past their questions. He placed the cub gently on the floor near the heater vents, angling them to blow warm air directly into the folds of the blanket. The cub shifted slightly, its eyes closing again. When the last student had been dropped off, Leonard drove straight through the storm to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center 2 towns over. The roads were barely passable, but he knew every curve, every patch where the drifts piled up. Inside the center's warm reception, the staff took the cub from his arms with practiced care. "You found him just in time," one of them said, checking the cub's paws for frostbite. Leonard just nodded, brushing melting snow from his sleeves. "Do what you can for him." They promised they would. He left without asking for updates, not because he didn't care, but because some part of him knew the cub belonged to the wild, and if he let himself hope too much, he'd be tempted to keep track of him like a pet. But the image of that small, shivering body curled in the ditch stayed with him for years. And now, every time the bear stepped out of the pines at the bend in the road, Leonard wondered if that moment had mattered as much to the bear as it had to him. For weeks after that snowstorm, Leonard found himself wondering about the cub. He told no one from the route, not the parents, not the kids, not even the other drivers at the depot. It wasn't something he felt the need to share. It was a quiet thing, between him and the winter. In those first few nights, he'd catch himself imagining the cub at the rehab center. He pictured it curled in a straw-lined crate, its fur finally dry, its chest rising steady under the watch of gloved hands and soft voices. The thought made it easier to sleep. Winter passed into spring. The roads cleared, the fields thawed, and Leonard settled back into his routine. By summer, the memory of the cub still lingered, but it no longer gnawed at him the way it had in those first days. It wasn't until 2 years later that the memory came rushing back in a way he couldn't ignore. It was an early April afternoon. The snowmelt had turned the ditches into muddy streams, and the air smelled of thawed earth and pine sap. Leonard was driving the old number 14 bus along his usual route, the golden light slanting across the road. As he came around the bend near mile marker 12, movement caught his eye on the right side. At first, he thought it was a deer, but the shape was broader, the coat darker. A young bear stood just off the shoulder, paws planted firmly in the grass. Its head turned toward the sound of the bus, and its ears lifted slightly. The bus slowed without Leonard thinking about it. For a moment, the two of them just watched each other. The bear's coat was thick and glossy now, its frame healthy, but something in the set of its eyes made Leonard's breath catch. It wasn't recognition in the way humans have it, no sudden spark, no dramatic shift. But there was a steadiness there, a calm that didn't belong to most wild bears seeing a vehicle up close. Leonard lifted a hand in a small, almost embarrassed wave. The bear didn't move, didn't flinch. Then the bus rolled forward, and the bend took the bear out of view. In the following months, Leonard noticed it again, always in the same place, always in the afternoons. Sometimes it was standing in the grass, other times sitting back on its haunches, watching the road like it was waiting for something. And maybe it was. He never stopped the bus. The kids would press their faces to the glass, whispering about the bus stop bear, but Leonard kept his eyes forward, smiling just enough to hide what he was thinking. By the time he retired, he had quietly counted more than a dozen times he'd seen the bear. And when he no longer had the route, he figured that would be the end of it. Until the day he walked down to the bend just before 3 o'clock, out of habit more than hope, and found the bear there again. Bigger now. Older. But waiting, just the same. That was the first day of what would become their new ritual. By the second week of his afternoon walks, Leonard realized other people had noticed the bear too. Living in a small mountain community meant news traveled fast, even without anyone meaning to spread it. The first to say something was his neighbor, Ruth Ellison, who stopped her pickup at the end of his lane one afternoon. "You know there's a bear that hangs around mile marker 12, she called, leaning out her window. Leonard gave a casual shrug. "Could be. Shows up same time every day," Ruth continued. "Right before 3. Just stands there like it's waitin' for the school bus." Leonard kept his face neutral. Strange. But when she drove off, he couldn't help the small smile that crept in. She had no idea how close to the truth she was. From then on, he noticed more and more cars slowing at the bend. Folks craning their necks, some even pulling out their phones. It made him uneasy. The bear wasn't a roadside attraction, it was a wild animal, one that had somehow decided he was safe to be near. The last thing Leonard wanted was people crowding him, tossing food, or worse, thinking it needed to be relocated for safety. So he kept his walks quiet. He never carried snacks, never tried to coax the bear closer. He just stood in his usual spot, a few yards back from the shoulder, and waited. The bear always emerged from the same break in the pines. The sound of its paws on the dry needles was soft, but Leonard knew it well now. Sometimes the bear stood, other days it would sit, its head slightly tilted as though listening for something only it could hear. Leonard found himself talking more on those afternoons, not loudly, but enough for his voice to carry across the short distance between them. He'd tell the bear about the weather, about Ruth's chickens escaping again, about the snowplow schedule. "You'd probably laugh," he said one day, leaning on his walking stick, "but I never thought retirement would have appointments." The bear didn't laugh, of course. But it didn't leave either. And that was enough. One rainy Thursday, Leonard almost didn't go. The clouds had been building since morning, the kind that rolled low and dark over the hills. But at 2:50, habit won out. He pulled on his jacket, braced against the wind, and headed down the lane. When he reached the bend, there it was, standing in the drizzle, water beading on its coat. Leonard stopped a few yards back, his boots sinking slightly into the wet ground. "You're a stubborn one," he said. The bear's ears flicked forward. In that moment, Leonard realized something. It wasn't the bus the bear was waiting for. It never had been. It was him. The storm rolled in faster than anyone expected. It was a Tuesday in late November, the kind of day when the air feels heavy, like it's holding something back. Leonard had spent the morning stacking wood in the shed, glancing now and then toward the ridge where the clouds had begun to darken. By mid-afternoon, the wind picked up, sharp and cold, carrying with it the first flecks of snow. Still, when the clock in his kitchen clicked over to 2:50, he reached for his coat and wool cap. The lane was already dusted white by the time he stepped out, the snow falling harder now. His boots crunched over the gravel, and each gust seemed to push against him, urging him back toward the warmth of the house. But Leonard kept going. When he reached the bend, visibility was low. The trees on either side swayed, their branches scattering snow into the wind. He half expected the bear might skip this day, hunker down somewhere dry and sheltered. Then he saw movement in the pines. The bear stepped out, its coat already flecked with snow, shoulders rolling as it made its way to the edge of the road. It stopped in its usual spot, lifting its head as if checking that he'd come. Leonard smiled, pulling his collar up against the wind. "You really don't miss a day, do you?" A sharp gust cut across the bend, spraying snow in their faces. Leonard squinted, taking a small step back, and that's when the bear moved. It stepped closer. Just a few feet, but enough for Leonard to feel the shift in their unspoken rules. For years, the bear had kept a careful, respectful distance. But now, in the swirling snow, it was closing that gap. Leonard stayed still, his hand resting on the top of his walking stick. The bear lowered its head slightly, not in aggression but in something else, a slow, measured acknowledgement. And in that moment, Leonard understood. It remembered. Not the way humans replay a memory, but in that deep, instinctual way animals carry the things that mattered most to their survival. Just like all those years ago, the snow was falling hard, the cold was biting deep, and Leonard was here. They stayed like that for minutes, snow settling on their shoulders, until the wind shifted again and the bear stepped back toward the trees. It glanced at him one more time before disappearing into the white. Leonard stood there long after it was gone, the snow stinging his cheeks. The memory of that winter in '99 pressed warm against the cold. The winter after that blizzard meeting was harder on Leonard than he liked to admit. It started with a cough in late December, the kind he thought would pass after a few days of rest. But by New Year's, the cough had deepened, leaving him winded after simple chores. Ruth stopped by one morning with a pot of chicken soup and a look that told him she wasn't buying his "just a touch of a cold" story. "You should see Dr. Holloway," she insisted. "I've been through worse winters," Leonard said, waving her off. Still, he stayed closer to home. His walks to the bend became slower, shorter. Some days he almost convinced himself to skip it altogether. But at 2:50, the habit tugged at him again, and so he'd pull on his coat and make the trek, even if it left him breathing heavier than he liked. The bear never missed a day. In the bitter cold of January, Leonard arrived to find it already there, waiting in the soft light of the low sun. Some afternoons it stood in the snow, ears pricked at the sound of his boots. Other days, it sat back on its haunches, watching him approach as though counting each step. One afternoon, the wind cut sharp through the pines, and Leonard stumbled slightly on the icy shoulder. Before he could steady himself, the bear took 2 slow steps forward. It was nothing dramatic, no charge, no sound, but there was a watchfulness in its posture, as though it had noticed something in his movement that wasn't quite right. Leonard chuckled under his breath. "You keeping an eye on me now?" The bear blinked slowly, its breath clouding the air between them. In the weeks that followed, the pattern repeated. On the days when Leonard felt weaker, the bear lingered longer. On the days when his steps were steady, it seemed more content to keep its usual distance. By mid-February, Leonard finally gave in and visited Dr. Holloway. The news wasn't dire, just a reminder that 78-year-old lungs didn't bounce back the way they used to. He left the clinic with a prescription and strict instructions to take it easy. Still, he didn't miss the walks. Because he knew, though he'd never say it aloud, that the bear wasn't just showing up for habit's sake. There was something in its presence that steadied him, a reminder that even out here, in a life that had grown quieter and lonelier than he'd planned, someone, or something, was still keeping track of him. By late March, the snow began its slow retreat from the hills, revealing patches of wet earth and last autumn's flattened grass. The air smelled of thawing pine needles and cold water trickling down from higher ground. Leonard's walks were easier now. The ice patches that had once made him cautious were shrinking, replaced by soft mud underfoot. He moved slower than he had in years past, but the cold no longer cut so sharply into his chest. The bear was still there, still on time. But something shifted the week the temperatures rose above freezing for good. It started with a sound in the early morning, a faint crunch of footsteps in the snow just beyond his yard. Leonard had been sipping coffee at the kitchen table when he heard it. At first, he thought it might be a deer nosing through the thawing brush. But when he glanced out the window, his breath caught. There, just at the edge of the tree line, stood the bear. It was the closest it had ever come to his home. The morning sun caught the sheen of its coat, steam rising from its breath in the crisp air. It wasn't moving toward the house, but it wasn't retreating either. Just standing, watching, as though checking in. Leonard stood slowly, setting his coffee down. He didn't go outside right away, he knew better than to rush into the space the bear had chosen. Instead, he stepped onto the porch quietly, letting the door close softly behind him. The bear's head lifted, its eyes finding him almost instantly. "Well," Leonard said in his low, steady voice, "you're a long way from the bend today." They stayed like that for a long moment, the only sound the soft drip of melting snow from the eaves. Eventually, the bear turned and walked back into the trees, its massive shoulders rolling with each step until it vanished into the shadows. When Leonard made the walk to the bend later that afternoon, the bear was there again, as if to prove the morning visit had been no accident. It happened twice more over the next week. Early in the morning, he'd catch sight of it near the edge of his yard, never crossing closer but never avoiding his gaze. Ruth noticed too. She stopped by one afternoon with a bag of groceries and said, "Len, I swear that bear's got your address memorized." He only smiled and said, "Maybe it just likes the view from my porch." But inside, he knew it was more than that. The bear had closed the distance on its own terms, and that meant something. The first warm week of April brought more than just the smell of damp earth, it also brought strangers to the area. Tourists tended to trickle in once the snow receded from the trails, eager to catch the early spring scenery. Leonard didn't mind them much, as long as they kept to the marked paths. But not everyone respected the rules. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Ruth came by with news. "You hear about those fellas from downstate?" she asked, leaning on his porch rail. Leonard shook his head. "Couple of them been wandering off the trail near the ridge. Taking pictures. One even tried to get close to a moose last weekend." Leonard frowned. "That's trouble waiting to happen." Ruth nodded. "Sheriff's keeping an eye out, but if you see anyone near the bend, you tell him." That conversation was still fresh in his mind 3 days later when he set out for his usual walk. The air was warm enough that he didn't need more than a light jacket. The roadside was soft underfoot, the mud sucking lightly at his boots. As he approached the bend, something felt different. The bear wasn't in its usual spot. Instead, he spotted it standing further up the road, halfway between the pines and the shoulder. Its posture was stiff. Leonard slowed, scanning the area. That's when he saw them, 2 men with cameras slung over their shoulders, standing maybe 30 yards away from the bear. They weren't close enough to touch it, but far too close for comfort. "Hey!" Leonard's voice carried sharp in the still air. "Back up." The men turned, startled. One raised his hands defensively. "We're just taking pictures." Of a wild animal that could close the distance in seconds, Leonard shot back. "Move." The bear hadn't moved, not toward the men, not toward Leonard. But its eyes stayed locked on them, its ears slightly back. Reluctantly, the men stepped away, muttering about how they weren't doing anything wrong. Leonard didn't answer. He waited until they were gone before turning back toward the bear. That was when it did something he'd never seen before. It walked toward him. Not charging, not rushing, just a slow, deliberate approach until it stopped well within the boundary it had kept for years. Leonard stood still, his breath steady. "Guess we both didn't like that," he murmured. The bear's gaze softened, or maybe that was just how Leonard wanted to see it. But as it turned and melted back into the trees, he felt something certain settle in his chest. This wasn't just habit anymore. The bear wasn't just showing up to see him. It was watching over him, too. The incident with the photographers faded from town gossip within a week, but Leonard carried it with him. It had been the first time he'd seen the bear position itself between him and someone else, and it stuck in his mind, like a bookmark in a chapter he wasn't done reading yet. Spring deepened. The grass grew in thick around the edges of his yard, and the first wildflowers appeared on the hillside behind the house. The air was warmer now, but Leonard still kept to his afternoon walks. Then came the day his knee gave out. It was late April, and he'd been clearing brush along the side of the house. The ground there dipped slightly, the soil still soft from thaw. One wrong step and his foot slid, twisting his knee sharply. He went down hard, the sudden pain sending a jolt through him. He tried to get up, but the joint refused to cooperate. The yard felt strangely quiet except for the wind moving through the pines. He pulled himself toward the porch, one slow drag at a time, until his back was against the steps. His breathing had gone shallow. And then he heard it, the soft crunch of something large moving through the brush. For a moment, he thought it might be Ruth or one of the neighbors. But when the sound grew closer, heavier, he knew. The bear emerged from the tree-line at the far edge of his property. It stopped, head low, nostrils flaring. Leonard didn't move. He didn't have the strength to stand, even if he'd wanted to. "It's all right," he said quietly, though his voice carried on the still air. The bear walked forward, slow but certain, its paws leaving deep impressions in the grass. It stopped a few feet from him, tilting its head. Leonard let out a shaky laugh. "Guess you noticed I'm not at the bend today." The bear stayed there for a long moment, watching. And then, as if satisfied, it turned and walked the perimeter of his yard, one slow circle, keeping to the edge of the grass before slipping back into the pines. It wasn't a rescue. The bear couldn't fix his knee. But Leonard understood the gesture for what it was. It had come to check on him. Later, when Ruth drove him into town for an X-ray, Leonard kept the story to himself. The bear was his secret, his and the Ben's. And now, maybe, his and the yard's too. The summer that followed moved slower than the others, but Leonard didn't mind. His knee had healed enough for him to walk without the cane most days, though he kept it by the door just in case. The yard was full of green again, the air thick with the scent of pine resin and warm soil. By June, it had become something of an unspoken truth in town. If you drove past mile marker 12 between 2:50 and 3:30, you might see the old man and the bear. No one tried to disrupt it. Maybe it was respect, maybe it was superstition. The sheriff never mentioned relocating the animal, and the locals never brought food or got too close. A few times, someone passing would give Leonard a wave, but they never lingered. It had become more than just a routine for him, it was the spine of his days. That July, something shifted again. The bear began arriving earlier, sometimes by 20 minutes or more, waiting in the shade of the pines until Leonard appeared. On warmer days, it would lie down, head resting on its forelegs, eyes half closed but still alert. One afternoon, Ruth joined him for the walk. She had never seen the bear up close before, and when they reached the bend, her steps slowed. "It's bigger than I thought," she whispered. Leonard smiled faintly. "Grew into itself, I suppose." The bear stood when it saw him, the same way it always did, a quiet acknowledgement, no sudden movements. Ruth stayed back a few paces, hands tucked in her jacket pockets, watching the way Leonard spoke to it in his low, steady voice. After a few minutes, the bear turned and melted back into the pines. Ruth let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "It's like it knows you," she said. "It does," Leonard replied simply. By August, the days began to shorten again, the light turning softer in the evenings. Leonard knew nothing lasted forever, not winters, not summers, and not even unspoken pacts between man and animal. But each afternoon the bear came, it felt like a quiet promise renewed. One golden evening near the end of the month, Leonard lingered longer than usual at the bend. The air was still, cicadas humming low, and the sky glowed with the kind of fading light that makes everything look like it belongs in a photograph. The bear stood a few yards away, its coat catching the light, eyes steady on his. Leonard took off his cap, holding it loosely in one hand. "Guess we've both made it through a few more seasons," he said. The bear's ears flicked at the sound of his voice. For a long moment, they simply stood there, two old souls in their own ways, sharing the same piece of road, the same quiet understanding. And when Leonard finally turned to walk home, the bear didn't leave right away. It watched him go, the way Leonard imagined it might watch the school bus once did. That was the last summer the bear came every day. When autumn arrived, the visits grew less frequent, 3 times a week, then once, then not at all. Leonard never worried. He knew it wasn't absence, it was simply the way of things. And every so often, on the edge of sleep, he could still picture that shape in the pines, waiting for him. The same way it had all those years ago, after the snowstorm that started it all.